The hour before the true dawn always possessed the most profound chill in Oakhaven Point, a cold that was not merely a drop in temperature, but a physical pressure, a weight pressing down upon the narrow, brine-caked planks of the main dock. Elias, 11 years old, and feeling the persistent sting of perpetual solitude, huddled deeper into the rough, oil-stained canvas jacket that Silas, the old fisherman, had given him last autumn. The jacket smelled overwhelmingly of diesel fuel, dried salt, and a faint, indefinable sweetness that Elias associated only with the deep, dark interior of Silas's wooden fishing vessel, the Wanderer. The sky overhead was still a dense, unbroken slate grey, the stars already swallowed by the creeping urban light pollution that never fully retreated, even in this small, isolated cove. The air vibrated with the low, resonant thrum of the diesel engine, already idling, sending a tremor through the worn leather soles of Elias's boots. Each breath he took was visible, a transient cloud of vapor that dissipated instantly in the pervasive wet air. Elias had been awake since 3:30, roused by the meticulous, rhythmic sounds Silas made. The scrape of the boot heel against the wood floor, the careful click of the heavy brass latch on the cabin door, the low hiss of the kerosene lamp being lit. Elias didn't require an alarm clock. The necessity of being useful was a more urgent driver. He knew, with the certainty of a child who depends entirely on quiet observation, that if he wasn't immediately present and ready to assist, Silas would silently leave him behind, not out of malice, but from a deeply ingrained belief in self-reliance that bordered on grim asceticism. He scraped the accumulated rime of the night's moisture from the Wanderer's low cabin window, using the edge of his thumbnail, the sound a thin, screeching protest against the silence. Inside, Silas was hunched over the low navigation table, his hands, thick and scarred like ancient driftwood, tracing lines on a chart illuminated by the wavering ochre glow of the lamp. Silas's face was a topographical map of deep weather lines, his heavy grey beard catching the light in scattered filaments. He wore the same dark blue woolen cap every day, pulled low over his forehead. "Ready, Elias," Silas stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to emanate directly from his chest cavity. It was not a question, nor an invitation, but a declaration of the universe's inevitable progression. Elias pushed himself away from the boat's damp hull, the muscles in his thighs already protesting the cold. He moved quickly to the bow, where the heavy, coiled ropes lay waiting, thick snakes draped across the wet decking. The act of untying the mooring lines required precision and strength disproportionate to his age. The rope was stiff, swollen with absorbed moisture, and the knot, a deeply seated bowline, had tightened under the weight and constant shifting of the previous day's tide. He bent low, his gloved fingers working with practiced, focused intensity. He felt the coarse fibers abrade the skin even through the heavy cotton gloves. The smell of the decaying seaweed trapped within the knot was immediate and sharp. His concentration narrowed to the specific geometry of the loop and the standing end, the goal being to loosen the friction without tearing the skin off his knuckles. He pressed his entire weight into a precise point of the rope, urging it to yield. The line gave way with a sudden sucking release, the heavy, waterlogged rope falling into a controlled coil at his feet. Elias secured the bitter end to the cleat on the deck, his breath coming faster now, the first successful physical exertion of the day warming the periphery of his core. Silas emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 chipped porcelain mugs of steaming coffee, dark and rich, diluted slightly with condensed milk for Elias. The heat radiated immediately into Elias's palms, a welcome, searing comfort. "Good work," Silas murmured, a high praise coming from him. "She fights you in the morning, likes her sleep." Elias took a grateful sip, the bitterness of the coffee cutting through the lingering taste of the cold air. They motored slowly out of the harbour mouth, the heavy Wanderer pushing a V-shaped wake through the glassy, oil-slicked water. Oakhaven Point, A cluster of tired, peeling white buildings receded quickly into the grey indistinctness of the shoreline. The world became only the boat, the engine noise, and the vast, cold expanse of the ocean. Silas steered the vessel toward the deep grounds, a fishing territory known for its treacherous currents but also its heavy yield of bottom dwellers. The journey took nearly 2 hours. Elias sat on the bench near the stern, watching the depth finder flicker with silent, glowing warnings. The monotony of the journey was broken only by the necessity of checking the oil pressure gauge and listening for any deviation in the steady rhythm of the engine. Tasks Silas had delegated to him, tasks that provided Elias with a crucial, if fragile, sense of belonging. When Silas finally cut the engine, the sudden absence of noise was jarring, a vacuum of sound that left only the gentle, persistent sloshing of the waves against the hull and the distant cries of gulls. The Wanderer bobbed gently, settling into the long, slow swells of the deep water. "Setting out," Silas announced. This was the hardest part. The net itself, a massive weighted contraption of dark nylon mesh, chain, and heavy iron weights, lay coiled like a sleeping beast on the deck. They used the hydraulic winch for the main haul, but the initial preparation required pure, back-straining human effort. Elias worked in careful tandem with the old man, their movements synchronized by years of unspoken understanding. Silas handled the heavy steel doors, the otterboards that kept the net spread wide along the seabed, lowering them with the winch cable, controlling the descent with slow, agonizing turns of the lever. Elias's job was to manage the guiding lines, ensuring they deployed without snags, paying out the heavy ropes hand over hand, feeling the friction burn through his gloves. The net sank into the black water, disappearing quickly. The heavy, taut cable sang a deep, low note under the immense strain. They waited, silent, for nearly 4 hours, the boat drifting languidly with the current. Elias busied himself with scrubbing the residual fish scales from the previous day's catch from the deck, his focus intense, scrubbing until the wood grain was clean and bright under the grey light. He felt the cold begin to seep back in, a gradual creeping numbness in his fingertips. The moment the haul began, the quiet intensity of the morning fractured. The diesel engine roared to life again, powering the hydraulics. The winch cable, thick and greasy, began its slow, grinding ascent, the steel groaning under the incredible tension of pulling tons of water, mud, and the bounty of the seabed back toward the surface. Elias braced himself against the railing, watching the cable, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm in anticipation. This was the moment of revelation, the payoff for the grinding cold and the solitude. The line tightened further, emitting a high-pitched metallic whine. Silas, his face set in a grim mask of concentration, maintained a steady pressure, monitoring the load indicator. The net, still far below, was fighting the pull, dragging against the resistance of the deep water. After what felt like an eternity, a slow, agonizing 10 minutes of the winch's mechanical complaint, the first evidence of the net's return broke the surface. The heavy otterboard slammed against the hull with a sickening thunk, spraying icy water across the deck. Elias instinctively ducked, the salty spray stinging his face. Then came the bulging mass of the cod end, the terminus of the net, swollen and distorted, filled with the dark, wet bounty. The stench hit them immediately. A complex, overwhelming aroma of crushed crustaceans, ozone, raw fish blood, and the deep, earthy smell of the silt disturbed from the ocean floor. Silas expertly maneuvered the boom, swinging the massive dripping bag of fish over the deck. The sound of the catch hitting the deck was a loud, wet splat, followed by a chaotic, flapping chorus of life, the silver flash of struggling fish, the duller tones of various ground species, and the unexpected bright red of deep-sea crabs. Elias, despite his exhaustion, moved with renewed vigor. He had to sort the catch quickly, tossing the valuable species into the refrigerated hold while throwing the junk fish and non-target species back overboard. His hands moved with blurring speed, classifying by sight, distinguishing the texture of rockfish from the firm flesh of lingcod. He was reaching for a particularly large, dark slab of halibut, its skin glistening and cold, when his fingers brushed against something wholly unnatural amidst the frantic, slimy chaos. It was hard, smooth, and strangely warm compared to the cold fish flesh surrounding it. He paused, the sense of intense, urgent focus momentarily interrupted. He pulled the halibut aside, dropping it with a wet thump, and dug deeper into the pile of writhing fish and entangled seaweed. His hand closed around the object. It was a glass cylinder, elongated and smooth, thick-walled and heavy. Elias lifted it into the dim light. It was a bottle, a simple, heavy glass container, completely encrusted with layers of marine growth. The glass was opaque, obscured by a dense layer of calcium deposits, barnacles, and a slimy film of algae that gave it a sickly greenish-brown sheen. It looked less like an object pulled from the sea and more like a relic excavated from a submerged, forgotten ruin. "What have you got there, boy?" Silas asked, his voice rough, having just dispatched a struggling crab. Elias held the bottle out. It felt disproportionately heavy, weighted not just by the thick glass, but by the layers of time that clung to its surface. Silas stopped sorting, his eyes, usually narrowed against the sun and wind, widening slightly as he took in the artifact. He reached out and grasped the bottle, turning it slowly in his massive, calloused hand. "Well now," he muttered, the tone indicating a shift from the tedious routine to something genuinely unexpected. "That's been down a while." Elias watched, fascinated. He could discern faintly that there was something inside, trapped within the glass. A scroll of paper, tightly rolled, resting in a small, dark reservoir of liquid at the bottom. Silas carried the bottle carefully toward the small freshwater hose near the cabin wall. The roar of the winch had subsided, replaced now by the rhythmic sloshing of the waves and the wet flapping of the diminishing catch. Silas turned the spigot just enough to release a thin, steady stream of water. He held the bottle under the flow, rubbing at the encrustations with the rigid bristles of a wire brush, usually reserved for cleaning the fish hold. The scraping sound was abrasive, high-pitched and insistent, cutting through the general harbor sounds. Elias leaned closer, watching as decades of accumulated history were slowly scrubbed away. The barnacles, tenacious and stubborn, resisted the initial cleaning, but the calcium deposits began to dissolve, revealing the thick, slightly flawed clarity of the ancient glass underneath. When Silas was satisfied, he held the bottle up to the grey light. The surface was now clean, albeit scratched and etched by its long imprisonment on the seabed. The glass itself possessed a greenish tint, characteristic of older manufacturing processes. The contents were now clearly visible. The bottle had been sealed with a stopper, a piece of cork or perhaps wax that had long since rotted away, allowing the sea to penetrate and claim the interior. The message itself was a tightly wound cylinder of paper, no thicker than Elias's thumb, stained a uniform sepia color, resting in the remaining dark, brackish water. "Cork failed," Silas observed, tracing the neck of the bottle with his thumb. "But the message looks intact." Elias felt a surge of unadulterated curiosity, a feeling far more vivid than the satisfaction of a successful haul. This was a mystery, a whisper from a world entirely separate from the present. "How long do you think?" Elias whispered, his voice hushed by the profound silence the object seemed to impose. Silas tilted the bottle, watching the water shift. "Hard to say. Years, decades maybe. That depth, the pressure, the cold. It preserves things strange down there. They had to get the paper out without destroying it." Silas went into the cabin and returned with a pair of long, narrow forceps. tools usually used for extracting hooks deep in the gullets of large fish. He worked slowly, with a jeweler's meticulous concentration, the gross strength of his hands refined into delicate precision. The paper was saturated, fragile, and stuck to the glass. Silas tapped the bottom of the bottle gently, urging the scroll to slide toward the neck. It was agonizingly slow. Elias watched the movement millimeter by painstaking millimeter. The paper, even submerged, looked incredibly brittle, ready to disintegrate upon contact with air or too much force. The paper, when it emerged, glistened wetly in the morning light. It was heavier than it looked, weighted with brine, drooping slightly at the edges. The smell was distinct, not the pervasive odor of fish, but something deeper, richer, like ancient ink mixed with cold, deep-sea decay. Silas laid the scroll carefully on the dry, clean wood of the navigation table inside the cabin. He straightened a small coil of thick copper wire, heating the tip with the flame of his lighter until it glowed dull red, and then used the heated wire with extreme delicacy to coax the tightly bound edges of the scroll to unfurl. The paper resisted, crackling softly, emitting a thin wisp of steam as the heat met the moisture. Elias held his breath, leaning over the table, his entire focus fixed on the unfolding drama of the past. When the paper was finally flat, pinned gently at the corners by small, heavy calibration weights, they could see the script. It was written in faded, black fountain pen ink, slightly blurred and bled by the saltwater intrusion, but still legible. The handwriting was sharp, cursive, and hurried, sloping urgently toward the right. The first thing Silas noted was the date, written starkly at the very top, slightly larger than the body of the message. Silas adjusted his reading glasses, sliding them down the bridge of his nose. He pointed a thick, steady finger at the number. "Look here, Elias. August 14th, 1950. The year landed between them like a physical object, heavy and incomprehensible. 73 years. The world that had existed when this note was sealed was a ghost world, a collection of fading black and white images and incomprehensible history. Elias struggled to fully process the sheer scale of the passage of time. Silas cleared his throat, the sound a dry rattle. He began to read aloud, slowly, deliberately translating the frantic strokes of the long-dead writer into the present moment. The paper felt colder than the surrounding wood, radiating the deep chill of the grave from which it had been pulled. The ink, though faded, conveyed an overwhelming sense of immediate, suffocating panic. To whomever finds this, you must listen. Do not dismiss this as a jest or a simple folly. It is the only way left. The storm has passed, but the sea has taken everything vital. I am adrift, no sight of land, the radio dead, the auxiliary engine useless. The vessel is the Lorelei, out of Oakhaven, fishing grounds, C4, but that is not the urgency. The urgency is the promise I broke. Silas paused, rubbing his brow, his expression tightening as the drama unfolded. Elias watched his face, interpreting the gravity of the words through the fisherman's involuntary reactions. My daughter Clara is 7 years old. She lives at 41 Shore Road, Oakhaven. She is weak. She has been sick since the spring, the sickness we cannot name. The doctor, Henderson, says she must have the blue medication, the one that came across the water, within 2 weeks, or the fever will consume her entirely. I swore to her mother before she passed that I would return today, August 14th, with the money for the full treatment. I have failed. The money, every single dime of the last year's earnings, hidden in the false bottom of the blue tackle box under my bunk, went overboard when the engine housing broke. I tried to save it, reaching for the box as it slid, but the sea took it, cold and swift. I'm not going to make it back. The hull is compromised. The Lorelei is heavy with water. I am writing this by the last flicker of the running light. This is what you must do if you have any heart left in you. Go to the house. Tell Mrs. Margaret Davies, my neighbour, who looks after Clara, that the money is lost. But tell her not to despair. I had a second savings, small, hidden not at home, but in the safe deposit box at the Oakhaven Bank and Trust, account number 72B. It is only enough for the first dose, but it is enough to buy time. She must go there, show them this name, the name of the account holder, and get the funds immediately. Do not delay. Do not wait for verification. The money must be withdrawn by Friday, August 18th. The bank is rigid. If the transfer paperwork is not completed by then, the account will be frozen until the estate is settled, and by then, Clara will be gone. Please, forgive my trespasses. Save my daughter. Tell her I tried. Tell her I love her more than the sea. Captain Eamon O'Connell. A profound, aching silence settled over the small cabin. The diesel engine, now turned off again, ticked softly as it cooled. The smells of salt and decay seemed to intensify, wrapping around the weight of the tragedy expressed on the paper. Elias felt a tightness in his chest, a constriction of breath that stemmed not from the cold, but from the raw, unfiltered grief of the Captain Eamon O'Connell. The message was not a whimsical curiosity. It was a desperate, final plea, a burden of life and death thrown into the vast emptiness of the ocean. Silas slowly lifted his glasses, his eyes appearing magnified and wet. He looked at the message again, specifically at the date, August 14th, 1950. 73 years ago, Elias, Silas murmured, the gravel in his voice more pronounced. 73 years too late. The impact of this realization was devastating. The urgency Eamon O'Connell had poured into those desperate, bleeding lines was now rendered meaningless by the glacial pace of the ocean and the simple march of time. The money, the bank account, the deadline of August 18th. All were irrelevant ghosts of bureaucratic necessity. But what about Clara? Elias fixated on the name, the 7-year-old girl battling an unnamed fever, waiting for her father to return with the blue medication. What happened to her? Elias whispered, the question hanging heavy in the small, enclosed space. Silas frowned, gently touching the edge of the paper. Hard to say, boy. O'Connell never came home. The Lorelei likely foundered quickly after he sealed this up. She either got the medicine or she didn't. For Elias, a boy who carried his own quiet, profound sense of displacement and loss, the idea of a child waiting and dying because a message arrived 73 years too late was intolerable. The emotional weight of the broken promise was almost unbearable. He needed to know. The message demanded a resolution, even if the consequence had already been rendered final decades prior. We have to go back to Oakhaven, Elias insisted, his voice trembling slightly with urgency. We have to find out about Clara O'Connell, if she lived. Silas studied Elias, his gaze deep and searching. The old man understood the boy's need. Elias saw himself in the unfulfilled destiny of Captain O'Connell's promise, the yearning for connection, the desperate hope for rescue, even if only from emotional abandonment. All right, Elias, Silas agreed, gathering the paper carefully and placing it into a thick, dry glass jar to prevent further decay. We cut the day short. We'll secure the gear, and we head back. But Oakhaven is small. Records might be difficult to find after this long. The journey back was tense and silent. The urgency of the 1950 message had somehow translated into a corresponding, agonizing urgency in the present. Elias felt the rhythmic throb of the engine as a countdown. When they docked at Oakhaven Point, the mid-morning sun had finally broken through the dense coastal fog, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light streaming into the covered dock area. They tied the Wanderer securely. Silas locked the glass jar containing the note into the ship's small safe, a sign of the importance he now placed upon the fragile artifact. First, we try the location, Silas determined. 41 Shore Road. Houses here, they don't always change hands. Sometimes they just get older. Oakhaven was a village cleaved into two distinct zones. the perpetually damp commercial chaos of the harbourfront, and the residential area perched on a low bluff above the water, facing the distant horizon. Shore Road was one of the oldest streets, lined with houses built from dark, salt-hardened timber, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The houses were close set, facing the sea with a defiant, weary permanence. Number 41 was a small, two-story salt box, severely in need of repair. The front porch sagged dangerously, and the window glass was warped, giving the interior a blurry, distorted appearance. The front lawn was choked with tenacious weeds and patches of yellowed, struggling grass. They approached the door. Silas raised a heavy iron knocker shaped like a stern-faced sea captain and let it fall once, the sound echoing hollowly inside. After a long pause, the door cracked open, revealing a sliver of an eye and a chain latch. The woman who opened it was ancient, her face deeply lined, her hair a fine halo of brittle white. She wore a thick, faded cardigan, despite the warmth of the sun. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice high and thin, laced with the fragility of extreme age. Silas, towering over her, spoke gently. "Excuse us, ma'am. We are looking for information about the family who lived here a long time ago. A man named Eamon O'Connell." The woman's hand, resting on the doorframe, trembled slightly. Her watery blue eyes fixed on Silas, then darted to Elias. "O'Connell," she repeated, the name tasting like dust in her mouth. "That name. It's been a long time since anyone spoke it aloud on this road." "Did you know them?" Elias asked, unable to contain his eagerness. The woman hesitated. Then, with an immense effort, she slid the chain off the door and opened it wider. The interior smelled distinctly of mothballs, old paper, and stale tea. "Come in, though I can't offer much. I'm Mrs. Finch. I've lived next door, number 43, since 1965. They stepped into the dimly lit, narrow hall. Silas explained the finding, the bottle, the date, the desperation of the message. He did not, however, reveal the exact contents, sensitive to the potential trauma the full story might inflict. Mrs. Finch listened intently, her hand frequently rising to her throat, her expression shifting from vague recollection to acute distress. 1950. Yes, that was the year. The year the Lorelei went down. It was a terrible, terrible storm. The whole town grieved for Eamon. He was a good man, strong as an ox. And his daughter, Clara. Silas pressed, careful and direct. "Do you know what happened to her?" Mrs. Finch lowered herself slowly onto a velvet-covered chair in the small living room. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering the threads of the past. "Clara, poor little thing, she was sickly, yes, always frail. Before my time, mind you. But the stories persist. The neighbours talk. She was 7 that summer. Her mother had passed the year before, consumption, I believe. Eamon was raising her alone, working himself to the bone." "Did she get the blue medication?" Elias asked, his voice cracking with intensity. Mrs. Finch opened her eyes, fixing on Elias with a look of ancient, sympathetic sorrow. "No, dear, she did not. The talk at the time, it was that the money Eamon had promised, the money for the specialty medicine from the city, never arrived. The neighbours, Margaret Davies included, they pooled what they had, but it wasn't enough for that specific treatment. Too expensive, too rare then. They tried everything the local doctor had, but the fever, it took her quickly after Eamon was lost. Within a week, the stories say. Elias felt the information land like a physical blow, heavy and sickening. The message, meant to save a life, had arrived a lifetime too late, confirming the most devastating of failures. The consequence was grave and final. Clara O'Connell had died because the ocean, in its slow, agonizing pace, had delayed a single vital piece of instruction. Silas rested a heavy hand on Elias's shoulder, a gesture of silent comfort. "And Margaret Davies?" Silas asked. "The neighbour who cared for her?" "Margaret," Mrs. Finch sighed, shaking her head. She carried the guilt of not being able to save Clara all her life. She passed away herself only 5 years ago, never married, never had children. She always said, "The sea is a cruel mistress. She takes the father and the daughter together, one by delaying the other." The realization was complete. The desperate mission of Captain O'Connell was a tragedy sealed 73 years ago. There was no action to take, no life to save, only the ghost of an overwhelming grief to address. Silas thanked Mrs. Finch profusely, offering a small, worn dollar bill for her time, which she reluctantly accepted. They walked back toward the harbor in silence, the bright sunlight seeming inappropriate for the darkness of the tragedy they had just confirmed. Elias's initial emotional urgency had curdled into a hollow, aching sadness. "The account, Silas." Elias finally spoke, his voice quiet. "The bank account, account 72B, did it matter?" Silas considered this. "It matters to the captain. It was his last effort, his final desperate hope for his daughter." The Oakhaven Bank and Trust was still located where it had been since the 1920s, a squat, limestone building on the corner of Main and Harbour, its facade imposing but now slightly worn around the edges. Inside, the atmosphere was sterile and quiet, smelling of polished wood and old money. They were directed to a younger clerk, a woman named Ms. Henderson. Silas, using his most professional, measured tone, explained that they were conducting historical research related to a long-defunct account, 72B, held by a man named Eamon O'Connell, seeking only to verify the status of the account in August 1950. Ms. Henderson was initially resistant, citing privacy laws and the sheer age of the request. But Silas, a fixture of the harbour for decades, possessed a quiet authority. He insisted that the information was related to a legal matter concerning maritime salvage, a small lie designed to facilitate the search. After a lengthy wait, during which Elias sat stiffly on a mahogany bench, contemplating the absurdity of seeking financial records from 3 generations past, Ms. Henderson returned, carrying a heavy, oversized ledger bound in cracked red leather. "This is the ledger for the 1950-1951 period," she said, her voice dropping to an academic hush. "It took us a while. The microfiche is notoriously difficult to read." She opened the book to the section detailing safe deposit box activity. She ran a painted nail down the column until she found the entry. Account 72B, held by Eamon O'Connell. Status, August 1st, 1950. Active. Balance, $78.35. Elias leaned forward, his eyes scanning the elegant, looping script of the ledger keeper. $78. A paltry sum now, but in 1950, enough perhaps for the first dose of the blue medication. They traced the entries through the remainder of August. August 14th, no activity. August 15th, no activity. August 18th, account frozen. Reason, transfer paperwork incomplete. Owner deceased, missing. The freezing date was the very deadline Eamon O'Connell had desperately cited in the message. The transfer papers had not been completed. Margaret Davies had not known about the account. The bank, in its inflexible adherence to procedure, had locked away the last slim chance of saving Clara. The ledger provided the final bureaucratic seal on the tragedy. "Is the account still frozen?" Elias asked, his voice thick. Ms. Henderson checked the final status page. It was finally liquidated, escheated to the state in 1975, unclaimed funds. The amount was never accessed by anyone. Silas thanked her, the raw data providing a brutal, objective confirmation of Mrs. Finch's subjective narrative. They walked out into the afternoon sunlight, the weight of the past clinging to them. "We found him, Elias," Silas said, his gaze distant. "We found Eamon O'Connell's failure, and we found Clara O'Connell's consequence. We know what happened." Elias shook his head, looking down at his boots, scuffing the toe against the pavement. Knowing isn't enough, Silas. He asked us to save her. We failed 70 years ago, but we received his message. We have to finish his mission. We owe him that. The mission is impossible, boy, Silas stated gently. There is nothing left to save. But there is something left to give, Elias countered, looking up, his eyes suddenly clear and intense. He died, wanting her to know he loved her and that he tried, and he wanted his broken promise to be forgiven. Silas understood. The objective reality was fixed, but the emotional architecture of the past required care and closure. What do you propose? We find the family, if any remain. We deliver his last words. And if there is no one left, we honor his struggle. The research now shifted from banking to archival records. They spent the next 2 days meticulously poring over the dusty, neglected resources of the Oakhaven Public Library, a small, dark building that smelled of decaying paper and lemon polish. Elias focused on the brittle, microfilmed copies of the Oakhaven Chronicle, the local newspaper. The small grey screens flickered with the ghostly images of mid-century life. Silas, meanwhile, delved into the property deeds and census records. It took 10 hours of intense, monotonous searching through the archives of 1950 before Elias found the obituary. Clara Margaret O'Connell, beloved daughter of the late Captain Eamon O'Connell, passed peacefully in her home on August 21st, 1950, after a brief illness. The brevity was stark, a cold finality, 3 days after the bank deadline, 7 days after her father's message was sealed in a bottle. Silas, through property records, found that Eamon's parents had predeceased him. Clara had no immediate surviving relatives in Oakhaven. All that was left were the names of the dead. "We need to find the grave," Elias insisted. "We must tell Eamon O'Connell that we delivered his message and that we know he tried." The Oakhaven Municipal Cemetery was located on the highest, windiest hill overlooking the town, its stone markers perpetually scoured by the sea air. It was a place of quiet, dignified decay. The cemetery caretaker, a taciturn man named Mr. Peterson, reluctantly helped them navigate the hand-drawn maps of the oldest sections. The O'Connell plot was small and contained 3 stones. The largest, severely tilted and covered in lichen, belonged to Eamon's wife, Margaret. Next to her, a newer stone, simple and square, Clara M. O'Connell, 1943-1950. "Rest in peace, little star." But there was no stone for Captain Eamon O'Connell. "He was lost at sea, son," Silas reminded Elias softly. "His body was never recovered. The sea was his grave." Elias stared at the little girl's stone, his heart heavy with the weight of that missed connection. He knelt in the damp, coarse grass beside the marker. The granite was cold to the touch. "He needed to tell her," Elias whispered, tears blurring the edges of the stone's inscription. "He needed to tell her he loved her more than the sea, and that he tried." Silas stood tall, watching the distant, restless expanse of the ocean. He pulled his knitted cap down tighter against the stiff, cold wind. "We deliver the message now, Elias. To the spirits, to the earth, to the memory of the father and the daughter." They returned to the Wanderer to retrieve the message. Elias carefully carried the heavy glass jar, protecting the brittle, sacred paper within. Silas found a small, smooth river stone, slightly flattened, and using a permanent marker, he wrote on the stone in bold, clear lettering, "Captain Eamon O'Connell, lost at sea, August 1950, a promise delivered." They returned to the gravesite. The sun was beginning to sink, casting long, melancholy shadows across the grass. Elias knelt once more beside Clara's stone. He retrieved the glass jar, slowly twisting off the lid. He gently pulled the fragile 1950 note from its dry confines. The weight of the parchment was negligible, yet it contained the emotional weight of 3 generations of grief. Elias held the note carefully, his hands barely touching the edges. He read Captain Eamon O'Connell's final, desperate words aloud, projecting the hurried, fading ink into the silence of the cemetery. He read the urgency, the failed bank account number, and the confession of the broken promise. Then he reached the final, essential lines. "Please, forgive my trespasses. Save my daughter. Tell her I tried. Tell her I love her more than the sea." Elias stopped, his voice choked with emotion. He looked at Clara's stone, speaking directly to the memory of the 7-year-old girl who never received her father's reassurance. "Captain O'Connell, sir," Elias said, his voice gaining strength despite the tremor. "Your message was received by us, Elias and Silas, in the year 2023. We traveled to Shore Road. We checked the bank records. We found the truth. We know the deadline was missed, and we know the fever took your daughter." Elias paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath of the cold air. "But we are here, Captain. I am telling your daughter now. I am telling Clara that her father tried. We found your loss, and we know you loved her more than the sea." He looked at the inscription on the stone. "Little star." "Clara," Elias whispered. "Your father never stopped loving you. He was trying to get the blue medicine. He never gave up." The delivery of the message, 73 years overdue, was a powerful, transformative act of emotional salvage. It didn't change the past, but it honored the struggle that the past represented. Silas stepped forward, placing the stone marker he had inscribed at the foot of Clara's grave, confirming the completion of the promise to the invisible father lost beneath the waves. Then Elias did the final, necessary thing. He gently folded the 1950 note back into a small square. He retrieved a small, heavy silver locket from the inner pocket of his coat, an object he had found years earlier in the sand, polished and empty, something he carried as a token of his own unknown past. He tucked the brittle, sepia-toned note carefully inside the locket, securing the clasp with a delicate click. The locket was heavy, cold silver, a repository for the desperate grief and the ultimate love of Eamon O'Connell. He stood up, looking at Silas, his eyes shining with unshed tears and a profound sense of closure. "It belongs with them," Elias stated simply. Silas nodded, understanding the symbolic weight of the act. Elias used the small, folding shovel they had brought to dig a shallow depression in the soft earth at the exact center of the O'Connell plot, placing the silver locket containing the final, desperate words between the graves of the mother and the daughter. He covered it gently with soil, patting the earth down firmly. The message had gone home. The promise, though failed in its immediate goal, was fulfilled in its ultimate intent. They stood together for a long moment, watching the sun finally dip below the horizon line of the vast, indifferent ocean. The wind shifted, carrying the sharp, cold scent of the sea up the hill. Silas placed both his hands on Elias's thin shoulders, his grip firm and steady. "You saved him, Elias," Silas said, his voice low and sincere. "You gave Eamon O'Connell peace. He can rest now, knowing his last words were heard and his promise was delivered." Elias felt a deep, warm release of the emotional tension he had carried since pulling the bottle from the net. The sense of urgency and consequence had been intense, but the final, simple act of conveying love across decades had provided a profound, unexpected form of superation. He realized that in giving peace to the dead, he had found a measure of belonging for himself. He had become, momentarily, a critical link in the endless chain of human connection and grief. They walked slowly down the steep hill, leaving the silent, cold dignity of the cemetery behind, moving toward the glimmering low lights of Oakhaven. The air was colder now, but Elias no longer felt the bone-deep chill. The heavy canvas jacket, smelling of diesel and salt, felt less like a burden and more like a necessary protective skin. The weight of the 1950 tragedy was gone, replaced by the profound, quiet satisfaction of a mission completed, not in action, but in heart.